Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. Europe enters the debate over its 2026 provisional budget, not as a confident union marching toward a shared horizon, but as a continent caught in a moment of profound introspection. Every line item in this temporary agreement, every euro allocated to cohesion, to energy, to agriculture, to crisis response, reveals something deeper about the state of the European project. It is not simply a budget. It is a mirror held up to a union that is anxious, divided, and uncertain of its long-term direction. For nearly 2 decades, Europe has been accumulating unresolved crises like geological layers, the financial breakdown of 2008, the sovereign debt emergencies in Southern Europe, the refugee waves of 2015, the pandemic of 2020, and now the war in Ukraine with its attendant energy shocks and geopolitical tremors. Each of these crises has left the Union slightly more fragmented, slightly less confident in its institutional architecture, and slightly more aware that its economic model, once envied for stability and social protection, is under serious strain. The 2026 provisional budget emerges in this context not as a bold blueprint for Europe's renewal, but as a pragmatic compromise designed to keep the machinery running for one more year. It is in many ways a stopgap solution, an agreement that buys time while sidestepping the deeper questions of Europe's future. Why provisional? Because Europe's political class remains divided, North versus South, East versus West, austerity versus investment, security first versus diplomacy first. And yet beneath the technical negotiations lies a broader philosophical question. What does Europe want to become in an age defined by geopolitical competition and economic transformation? The numbers themselves reveal the tension. Europe faces sluggish growth, declining industrial competitiveness, and rising fiscal pressures from aging populations and defense rearmament. Germany, the traditional engine of the Union, grapples with manufacturing contraction and energy vulnerabilities. France, with its long-standing social commitments, confronts rising debt and political volatility. Southern Europe still struggles beneath the weight of stagnant productivity and structural unemployment. Eastern Europe seeks increased security guarantees as the war in Ukraine continues to reshape the regional landscape. Against this complex backdrop, the EU's 2026 provisional budget tries to balance multiple conflicting imperatives, stabilize weaker economies, maintain investment in innovation and green transition, reassure Eastern Europe of continued commitment, and keep the Union fiscally responsible enough to maintain long-term coherence. But these goals taken together often contradict one another, reflecting the deeper dissonance within the European project. A budget cannot solve a crisis of vision. It can only expose it. Europe's broader challenge is philosophical and geopolitical. The Union has been pushed into a reactive posture, responding to shocks rather than shaping events. It reacts to American industrial subsidies. It reacts to energy disruptions caused by the Ukraine war. It reacts to the rise of China and the reassertion of Russia. It reacts to migration trends, demographic shifts, and political polarization. What Europe lacks is a proactive continental strategy, a shared understanding of its place in a world undergoing rapid transformation. This is why the 2026 budget matters, not because of its specific allocations, but because of what those allocations say about Europe's collective mindset. The provisional nature of the agreement reflects hesitation, the hesitation of a family of nations that has not yet reconciled competing priorities. Some member states fear economic collapse without strong fiscal support. Others fear loss of competitiveness without industrial investment. Still others fear geopolitical vulnerability without a clear security commitment to Ukraine. The question then is simple but profound. Can Europe still act as a unified entity when confronted with the pressures of a changing world? If the EU aspires to emerge from this decade stronger, economically more competitive, politically more coherent, and strategically more autonomous, it must rediscover the founding principles that brought it into existence: solidarity, shared investment, peace building, and the recognition that Europe succeeds when it chooses cooperation over fragmentation. The 2026 provisional budget tells us that Europe is not yet ready to make that leap, but it also reminds us that the Union still possesses the institutional foundation, the historical memory, and the moral capability to reclaim its vision if it chooses to do so. When I examine the European Union's provisional 2026 budget, I see more than a spreadsheet of appropriations and political compromises. I see a civilization wrestling with its own architecture, its capacity to adapt, to unify, and to endure. The headlines will present this budget as a victory of negotiation, a sign that Europe can still reach consensus despite its political fractures. But the deeper truth is more fragile consensus in today's Europe is not a reflection of shared vision, but of shared anxiety. This budget is not Europe's declaration of strength. It is Europe's admission of uncertainty. To understand the full implications of this new fiscal framework, we must explore three concentric circles of European vulnerability: the economic base, the geopolitical burden, and the structural contradictions of the Union itself. Only by examining all three can we understand what 2026 truly represents for the EU. First, the economic base. Europe enters 2026 not as a unified engine of industrial renewal, but as a patchwork of uneven recoveries. Germany's manufacturing exhaustion, Italy's demographic stagnation, France's fiscal rigidities, and Eastern Europe's dependency on external investment create a mosaic of fragilities that no single budget can repair. The EU's Growth and Stability Pact, long a symbol of the bloc's fiscal orthodoxy, has been stretched, revised, and massaged into a shape that barely resembles its founding logic. Europe's policymakers now spend more time interpreting the pact than following it. The 2026 budget injects funds into innovation, green transition, and social cohesion, yet all of this takes place under conditions where Europe's competitiveness gap with Asia widens, not narrows. A budget can distribute resources. It cannot manufacture dynamism. That requires strategy, unity, and political courage. Three qualities Europe increasingly struggles to mobilize. Second, the geopolitical burden. The war in Ukraine has exposed one of Europe's deepest contradictions. It calls for strategic autonomy while depending profoundly on American military power. Europe wants to define its own future, yet the security architecture in which it lives remains overwhelmingly designed in Washington. The 2026 budget, even with increased defense and external action allocations, does not alter this basic asymmetry. Support for Ukraine, financial, humanitarian, logistical, remains one of the largest political questions overshadowing the year ahead. Will Europe continue to fund the Ukrainian state? Will it expand military aid, or will war fatigue erode political will? The truth is that 2026 will not answer these questions. It will merely postpone them. Europe's commitment is real, but not limitless. Voters across the continent are turning inward, distressed by inflation, immigration, and social fragmentation. As the political center shrinks, the capacity for coherent geopolitical policymaking shrinks with it. Ukraine depends on Europe, but Europe increasingly depends on its own electoral psychology. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, the structural contradictions of the EU itself. Europe is a union of sovereign states, yet sovereignty is precisely what constrains Europe's capacity to act as a single power. The 2026 budget once again reflects this tension: too small to be transformative, too complicated to be efficient, and too politicized to be strategic. Europe's great problem is not that it lacks money, it is that it lacks a shared narrative. Nations see the EU's purpose through different historical lenses: Germany through the lens of fiscal discipline, France through leadership ambition, Eastern Europe through security, Southern Europe through development. A budget cannot fix philosophical incoherence. This is why, at its core, the 2026 provisional agreement is both an achievement and a warning. It shows Europe can still function, but also that Europe is functioning with difficulty. The continent's crises, economic stagnation, geopolitical exposure, structural imbalance do not stem from insufficient funding, but from insufficient alignment. Europe is a world power in potential, but a mid-level actor in practice. Its financial tools are carefully designed, but its political imagination remains constrained by national instincts. If Europe is to rise from this moment of fragmentation, it must realize one simple truth: the greatest danger it faces is not Russia or China or global markets. It is its own reluctance to become something more than the sum of its parts. The 2026 budget buys Europe time, but time alone does not create history. Europe must choose to shape its future rather than merely survive its present. When I turn to the question of Ukraine, within the framework of the EU's 2026 budget, I see a continent confronting not merely a foreign conflict, but the limits of its own strategic imagination. The war has become Europe's defining geopolitical test, not because Europe chose it, but because Europe cannot escape it. Ukraine is both a moral commitment and a geopolitical liability, a symbol of European values and a reminder of Europe's structural weaknesses. And the 2026 budget, however, carefully constructed circles around this dilemma without resolving it. Let me start with the central paradox. Europe wants peace, yet it has built no pathway toward peace. Europe wants to support Ukraine, yet it has no long-term strategy for such support. Europe wants strategic autonomy, yet it acts within a security architecture designed elsewhere. This is the contradiction that defines the continent's current posture. 1. The budgetary mirror Europe's moral burden weighed against its limits. The 2026 budget earmarks funds for humanitarian aid, macro-financial assistance, and reconstruction planning for Ukraine. These are not trivial commitments. They reflect real sacrifice from European taxpayers. Yet they also reveal the limits of what Europe can sustain. Europe is not a war economy, nor does it wish to become one. But as the conflict persists, the financial flows required to stabilize the Ukrainian state resemble something much closer to wartime financing than to conventional EU aid. Europe must now ask itself, is it preparing Ukraine for sustainable recovery or merely subsidizing a war with no clear horizon? The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between a long-term vision and political drift. 2. War fatigue, the silent rising force shaping Europe's future. Across the EU, public sentiment is shifting, not necessarily anti-Ukrainian, but certainly weary. European households face inflation, energy, volatility, and stagnant wages. Governments face deepening fiscal constraints. Political parties face volatile electorates where economic insecurity increasingly outweighs geopolitical conviction. The reality is, unavoidable war fatigue is becoming a political force, silent, slow, but structurally powerful. This fatigue does not mean Europe will abandon Ukraine, but it means that the politics of continued support will grow more fragile, fragmented, and conditional. The center weakens, populist parties rise, and the consensus that held Europe together during the war's initial phases becomes more difficult to maintain. 3, the missing strategy, Europe's inability to articulate an endgame. A war cannot be supported indefinitely without a coherent endgame, yet Europe has not articulated one. Leaders repeat familiar slogans as long as necessary until victory for Ukraine's sovereignty. But these are expressions of sentiment, not strategy. They do not explain what victory means, how negotiations might begin, or what Europe is prepared to accept in a post-war settlement. Europe stands at a crossroads. Continue funding Ukraine at high levels, risking long-term political backlash. Push for negotiations, risking division with Washington. Expand defense commitments, risking further militarization of the European project. None of these options are politically comfortable. Each carries profound implications for Europe's identity. 4, the geopolitical trap Europe's dependency on U.S. decision-making. Europe's military support for Ukraine is deeply intertwined with the strategic preferences of the United States. If Washington accelerates, Europe accelerates. If Washington hesitates, Europe hesitates. This is not autonomy, it is alignment. And alignment, while sometimes necessary, cannot substitute for a continent's own geopolitical reasoning. This asymmetry shapes the 2026 budget in ways that are not openly acknowledged. Europe's financial commitments implicitly assume that Washington will remain committed not only politically but materially. The U.S. election cycle thus becomes an unspoken variable inside Europe's economic planning. This is not a sustainable foundation for continental strategy. 5, the deeper truth, Europe is responding to a crisis, not designing a future. When I consider the EU's approach to Ukraine through the lens of 2026, I am struck by a structural pattern. Europe reacts to events rather than shaping them. It responds to crises with funding instruments, committees, declarations, and procedural mechanisms. What it does not produce, because it cannot, is a unified geopolitical philosophy capable of guiding long-term decision-making. Europe has money, it has institutions, it has moral aspiration. What it lacks is coherence. The provisional 2026 budget reflects this beautifully and painfully. It sustains Ukraine, yet cannot define the strategic horizon. It preserves unity, yet exposes fragility. It signals commitment, yet reveals uncertainty. Europe is caught between the duty to act and the fear of consequence. Until the continent resolves this tension between values and interests, between unity and sovereignty, between strategy and inertia, its approach to Ukraine will remain provisional, much like the budget itself. Europe today stands at a strategic crossroads, one shaped not merely by accounting ledgers or negotiated budget lines, but by a deeper philosophical question. What ultimately is the European Union for the provisional 2026 budget? Carefully balanced, fiscally constrained, and politically fragile, reveals a union attempting to reconcile its domestic social commitments with the expanding geopolitical burdens it has inherited. But in truth, no amount of technical budgeting can fully mask the existential dilemma facing Europe. A union conceived for peace is now asked to finance a war whose end remains uncertain and whose consequences press sharply against the. To understand the choices before the EU, one must begin with the tectonic pressures shaping the continent. Europe is aging rapidly. Its industrial base is under pressure from American subsidies, Chinese industrial competitiveness, and global supply chain reconfiguration. And crucially, its political consensus, once thought unshakable, is fragmenting under the weight of surging populist movements, internal policy disputes, and widening economic inequality among member states. In such a climate, any budget discussion becomes more than a fiscal matter. It becomes a referendum on Europe's identity. Thus, the question of Ukraine's financing, whether Europe continues to shoulder the lion's share of non-military assistance, cannot be understood outside this broader structural context. For 2 years, the conflict forced the Union into an unplanned geopolitical role. Europe, rather than the United States, became the main economic lifeline for Kyiv, sustaining public salaries, stabilizing the banking system, providing humanitarian assistance, and subsidizing energy resilience. This was not merely foreign aid. It was state building by proxy, undertaken at a time when Europe itself was struggling to prevent internal fractures from widening. It is in this context that the 2026 budget negotiations acquired their political gravity. The fundamental issue is not whether Europe can technically afford support for Ukraine. Europe's collective GDP gives it ample resources, but whether continued financing aligns with the Union's internal priorities. Many member states are already strained by inflation, energy insecurity, and fiscal tightening required by the reactivated Stability and Growth Pact. Southern Europe faces rising debt burdens. Eastern Europe seeks greater investment in development. Western Europe demands more funds for green transformation and technological innovation. Each of these demands competes with the escalating cost of war. This leads to an uncomfortable but essential truth. Europe cannot finance both a long-term war and an ambitious program of internal renewal without redefining its fiscal rules and political commitments. And that redefinition remains elusive. Part of the problem is strategic ambiguity. European leaders publicly affirm long-term support for Ukraine, yet internally, governments are divided on whether the conflict is fundamentally winnable or whether Europe must prepare for a negotiated settlement. Some argue that Ukraine's fight is Europe's fight, a moral and strategic necessity. Others view the conflict as primarily a U.S.-Russia geopolitical confrontation in which Europe is absorbing the economic and security consequences. Still others quietly worry that the continued militarization of Eastern Europe risks transforming the EU into a security appendage of Washington rather than an autonomous actor capable of shaping its own foreign policy. The 2026 budget, therefore, is not simply a compromise. It is a symptom of Europe's profound uncertainty. It allocates enough funds to signal continuity, but not enough to guarantee a long-term strategy. It is both a gesture of solidarity and an admission of fatigue. What Europe urgently lacks is a coherent project that unites its fiscal policy with its geopolitical aims. If the Union chooses to maintain strong support for Ukraine, then it must openly commit to structural reforms, a larger centralized budget, common debt instruments, and an industrial strategy capable of reinvigorating Europe's productive capacity. Without this, support for Ukraine will become financially unsustainable and politically divisive. Alternatively, if Europe quietly shifts toward de-escalation and diplomatic compromise, a path many European publics increasingly favor, it must articulate a peace framework that does not undermine its credibility or its foundational commitment to international law. In either path, ambiguity is Europe's greatest enemy. A union that tries to finance a war without fully acknowledging its economic implications risks undermining itself from within. A union that signals commitment without providing adequate resources invites strategic vulnerability. And a union that avoids articulating its long-term geopolitical role will find itself increasingly shaped by external powers, whether Washington, Moscow, or Beijing, rather than shaping its own destiny. The provisional 2026 budget is therefore not merely a financial document. It is Europe's mirror, revealing a continent that stands between prudence and purpose, between internal solidarity and external responsibility. The next step requires not just numbers, but vision. As the European Union edges toward the second half of this turbulent decade, it becomes increasingly clear that the challenges of the present cannot be met by the frameworks of the past. The provisional 2026 budget, while technically competent, ultimately serves as a reminder that Europe's predicament is not fiscal but philosophical. The Union faces a deeper question, one that budgets alone cannot answer. What kind of Europe does it seek to become? A defensive continent forever responding to crises, or a proactive, coherent political union with the capacity to shape global outcomes? To move forward, Europe must begin by embracing a more integrated economic strategy, one that acknowledges the structural weaknesses exposed by the pandemic, the energy shock, and the Ukraine conflict. Europe's industries are losing ground, not because of a lack of talent or capital, but because the EU lacks the scale, coordination, and unified investment strategy that the United States and China deploy with remarkable discipline. A fragmented market cannot compete with continental giants. Thus, the first step toward renewal is strategic coherence, a commitment to joint investment in energy transition, digital sovereignty, and industrial modernization. Such investments cannot be patchwork initiatives dispersed across 27 national budgets. They must emerge from a centralized fiscal capacity, an expanded EU budget, or a new phase of common borrowing modeled on the Recovery Fund. Without this, Europe's aspirations for autonomy will remain rhetorical rather than real. The second step requires moral clarity. Europe must decide whether its long-term engagement in Ukraine is fundamentally a security obligation, a humanitarian duty, or a geopolitical choice. If it is indeed a long-term strategic priority, then the Union must be prepared to finance Ukraine's reconstruction, support its institutions, and invest in an eventual accession pathway. But if Europe ultimately views the conflict as unsustainable, then it must pivot toward diplomacy with the same seriousness it once applied to sanctions and deterrence. In either case, the current posture of partial commitment and strategic ambiguity cannot endure. The third step is internal Europe must restore political legitimacy within its own societies. The rise of populism is not a temporary flare-up, but a structural outcome of economic fragmentation, inequality, and the perception that EU elites are disconnected from the everyday realities of citizens. A credible European strategy must address these anxieties through investment in social cohesion, fair taxation, and economic opportunities that extend beyond the continent's prosperous urban cores. Europe's strength has always derived from its social contract. Its renewal must begin there. Finally, Europe must reclaim its identity as a force for peace. The EU was born not as a military bloc, but as a democratic and humanitarian project grounded in reconciliation. Its greatest contribution to global affairs has always been the belief that cooperation can replace conflict, that diplomacy can prevent catastrophes, and that economic interdependence can create stability. In an era increasingly defined by rivalry among great powers, Europe has the opportunity and perhaps the responsibility to articulate a different path. The 2026 budget, constrained though it is, can be a foundation for that vision. But it will require Europe to shift from crisis management to long-term strategy, from fragmentation to unity, and from reactive politics to purposeful global leadership. If the EU embraces this moment, it may yet transform uncertainty into renewal and reclaim its place as a moral and economic compass in a rapidly changing world.